I wanted to take a few moments to share a few thoughts on the barriers and potentials in our current socio-political environment. Each day, our world is moving closer and closer to being consumed by the deep contradictions that fuel the manufactured realities of billions of people across the world. In response to this, there are pockets of resistance that are finding creative ways to address these manufactured realities, finding continuities and solidarity with others who are engaged in struggle, using means and methods that circumvent the methods and means of those who seek to dominate them. Being so, the mass character of this resistance is still reacting to the parameters of struggle set by those who seek to dominate them. We must begin to make substantive progress to move beyond struggle, to move from reacting to a fully developed response. Writing in 1965, Frantz Fanon urges in A Dying Colonialism that the radio must become a tool for social transformation. 118 years before Fanon, a report on the proceedings of the National Convention of Colored People and their Friends, held in Troy, New York, on the 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th of October, 1847, understood the role of and potential use of multimedia mechanisms in liberation. This report reflected, of the means of the advancement of a people, placed as we are, none are more available than the press. We struggle against opinions. Our warfare lies in the field of thought. Glorious struggle, God-like warfare, in training our soldiers for the field, in marshaling our hosts for the fight, in leading the onset, and throughout the struggle, we need a printing press, because a printing press is a vehicle of thought. It is a ruler of opinions. Are we asking and seeking the answers to the questions that deeply reflect on the conditions within which we live today? Can we see beyond struggle in order to chart paths towards that place of liberation? The question upon which this reflection is built is simple enough. How, after many, many years of struggle, many, many years of resistance and exposure to the deep structures of racism, critiques of racial capitalism, examination of the historical processes of domination, the long history of anti-slavery, the struggle against Jim Crow, sexual marginalization here in the United States, and on an international level, anti-colonial resistance in Africa and the Americas, explorations and warnings of neocolonialism, the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. At this point in history, we're right back at those moments. It seems to me in this present period, we know a lot, but understand very little. We are at a moment where people are mightily defending the myths of origin of the nation state and blindly accepting the myths of a post-racial world. All of this is cloaked within the promises of racial capitalism. What is even more suspect are the myths wrapped in the constellation of contradictions that says the attainment of education and degrees provide a clear path towards social economic advancement for all. How can we explain or tacitly accept the idea peddled by commentators, pundits, and others, where at best, every analysis that is centered on issues surrounding race, class, gender, sexual orientation, etc., end or begin with this statement: we have made much progress, but we have very far to go. With this in mind, what I propose as we think through this together is that we examine the dialectical processes of respond-react within the praxis of those who teach, as well as those who are engaged in some sort of activism or activist behavior. In an article published March 2016 in the Boston Review, written by Robin D.G. Kelly, titled Black Study, Black Struggle, he shares some ideas that I think can serve as a basis from which we can anchor this Thinking Out Loud session. In this article, Kelly says he wanted to share a few observations and speculations about the movement, its self-conception, and its demands, many of which focus on making the university more hospitable for Black students. I am not opposed to this, he says, nor am I questioning the courageous students who have done more to disrupt university business as usual than any movement in the last half-century. Instead, he says he wants to draw attention to the contradictory impulses within the movement, the tension between reform and revolution, between desiring to belong and rejecting the university as a cog in the neoliberal order. I want to think about what it means for Black students to seek love from an institution incapable of loving them, of loving anyone perhaps, and to manifest this yearning by framing their lives largely through the lens of trauma, Kelly writes. He wants to think about what it means for Black students to choose to follow Stefano Harney and Fred Moten's call to become subversives in the academy, exposing and resisting its labor exploitation, its gentrifying practices, its endowment built on misery, its class privilege often camouflaged in multicultural garb, and its commitments to war and security. Contextualizing this article, it is important to note that Kelly wrote this article as a meditation of the protests that were happening on college campuses that were engulfed in the flames ignited by the streets of Ferguson, Missouri. Robin Kelly goes on to write that the primary purpose in which he wrote it was to challenge student activists to not cleave their activism from their intellectual lives. Moreover, to encourage student activists to carefully consider the language they use to frame their grievances. In particular, he argued that while trauma can be an entrance into activism, it is not in itself a destination and may even trick activists into adopting the language of the neoliberal institutions they are at pains to reject. It is here, as we think through this together, that I think that we should begin to push the ideas from activists and thinkers such as Amilcar Cabral, Kwame Ture, Sylvia Wynter, Claudia Jones, Ella Baker, Amir Baraka, Ferenc Fanon, in examining our present moment of contestation, paying particular attention to the knowledge and practices it produces. More specifically, what fuels the limitations of knowledge productions and practices that are produced from this historical moment of clear contestation, a moment that has its roots in the protracted contestations to the contradictions inherent in society organized upon racial capitalism. How do we choose one form of knowledge opposed to other forms of knowledge? Why are we intent to arrest our capacities to substantively address historical wrongs in contemporary times? It is within this environment that this moment calls us all to confront the material production of ideological representations. This task becomes essential in order for us to understand the deep contradictions in the normalized statement: we have made progress, but we have much further to go. It is time to critique our critiques, to analyze the methods and methodologies with which we use to understand the interdependence of past, present, and future. To put it another way, how we frame an issue, the worldview we use, directly guides the way we will understand it and therefore directs the way we will address it. Let's see what I mean. Let's think together. Is criminal justice working or is it broken? The answer depends directly upon the efforts captured in reform or rebuild. The worldview which informs the perspective through which we will understand the processes of the criminal justice system will determine the language, therefore the tools that we use to either tinker with or replace the entire system. As we continue to think together, what is the difference between civil and human rights? Again, the discourse we use to frame specific or collective issues guides our capacities to see and or develop the necessary tools with which we seek partial or holistic remedy. Last one. Why is it important, particularly as it concerns debates in international law, to refer to the slave trade as the transatlantic slave trade instead of a human trafficking issue? To freeze the processes of enslavement, the ideological, material, and spiritual processes necessary to dehumanize a people, in time distorts and relieves those nations and peoples from responsibility, as the historically specific activities cannot be directly related to contemporary activities. Therefore, framing is essential to understanding the dialectical nature of respond and react, pushing the limits of current knowing, seeking a breakthrough of understanding that serves as a foundation towards new forms of consciousness that produce new ways of constructing our material realities. To be at a moment in the 21st century of 14th century ways of understanding the world through binary frames of reference begs us to consider, when will we, particularly those engaged in activism or some type of activist activity or some type of policy advocacy, stop reacting and start to substantively responding? Let's consider the conceptual use of social justice as currently understood to address age-old inequities. What I propose is a deep engagement with the praxis of social justice by thinking through the dialectical processes inherent in the respond-react relationship. It is an attempt to move beyond, to think beyond struggle, to imagine a world we see in art, we hear in music, we taste in our favorite food. The world of space in between spaces, the world that moves our unconsciousness to consciousness, the work that we do in these spaces. The spaces that Fred Moten and Stefano Harney called the undercommons are important to recognize, to become conscious of, to learn from, curate new ways of knowing, a knowing that informs our deep resistance to deep inequities. Do we know, and more importantly, are we willing to make the necessary intellectual and practical sacrifices for social justice? Or, as I hope to do in sharing these thoughts with you, push us to evolve our notion of social justice to human justice based on a critical human rights consciousness? Let's think back to that simple question again. Well, simple as in multi-level, deeply entangled in the complexities of knowledge, development, power, race, and class. Have we been arresting our attempts to address inequities because we are bound by the narrowing limitations of reacting to these inequities, opposed to responding to them? What will it take to move beyond struggle, to move from reacting to responding? What is social justice to those communities that have been and are continually marginalized, even after social justice has been legislated or judicially decided? Is our definition of social justice limited? What about economic justice? What about cultural justice? What about political justice? What about sustained justice, environmental justice? The fact that we have to deeply conceptualize justice indicates there is indeed a problem. One expression of what is meant by social justice is found in the Declaration of Human Rights, where a number of norms about equality are stated. However, they very often suffer from the deficiency that they are personal more than structural. They refer to what individuals can do or can have, not to who or what decides what they can do or have. They refer to the distribution of resources, not the power over the distribution of resources. In other words, human rights, as usually conceived of, are quite compatible with paternalism, whereby power holders distribute anything but ultimate power over the distributions, so that equalization without any change in the power structure is obtained. Maybe because our conceptualization of the human is limited. To be clear, we are defined mostly and primarily in economic frames of reference. The economic human defined in terms of profit, value, capital accumulation. Our activities must be monetized or else they will be worthless. In fact, if we do not, we will very well starve. We live in a world where, according to Hart and Negri, in the post-modernization of the global economy, the creation of wealth tends ever more towards what we call biopolitical production, the production of social life itself, in which the economic, the political, and the cultural increasingly overlap and invest one another. The inability to move from unconscious to conscious, moving from reacting to responding, evolving our frames of reference, requires us to examine the relevant barriers. Here, I do not want to imply that or what we intend to think through next are the only barriers, nor are they fully fleshed out. But one of the barriers, I argue, is encapsulated in the physiological and biomolecular implications of trauma. What am I arguing here is that we must map and highlight how trauma affects our ability to think, how it has affected our ability to produce and develop certain forms of knowledge and not others. Multiple biomedical and genetic studies show that the brain areas implicated in the stress response include the amygdala, hippocampus, and prefrontal cortex. Traumatic stress can be associated with lasting changes in these brain areas. In the case of the African world, continental and diasporic, this trauma took on many forms and is directly rooted in the conditions within which the processes of marginalization and oppression took place. What do I mean here? French colonialism, although had similar objectives to that of other forms of colonialism, it was practiced in a very particular way. Spanish, Portuguese, British each refined and perfected their own mechanisms of control and domination for exploitation. Southern chattel slavery in the U.S. operated in the most nuanced ways within the United States. In the case of indigenous communities, in the case of generational poverty, the trauma inherent in the processes of structural violence are deep and must be exposed. Here, again, theory of structural violence serves as a vital frame to understand the implicit and explicit forms of trauma. Structural violence refers to a form of violence wherein social structure or social institutions and systems propagate harm to people by preventing them from meeting their basic needs. To think about this more materially, consider that approximately more than 100,000 African Americans or people of African descent will die every year simply because they are Black. A more recent study found that more than 200,000 thefts are attributable here in the United States to poverty and income inequality, to the social conditions that are closely tied to structural violence. Consider tens of thousands of farmers in Uganda are illegally dispossessed, their homes burned by an international forestry company. The trauma that is inflicted becomes deeper when the forestry company closes down and lays off its workers. This is structural violence. What I want to propose as we think through this together is a critical human rights consciousness as a response to a false consciousness. A false consciousness, the notion that members of a particular class or group unwittingly misperceive their real position in society and systematically misunderstand their genuine interests within the social relations of production under capitalism. Thus, a false consciousness denotes people's inability to recognize inequality, oppression, and exploitation in that particular system because of the prevalence of views that naturalize and legitimize the existence of social classes and the social structures and systems that support and maintain the power of these particular classes. What I present is a call to build platforms that allow us to develop a deep, critical human rights consciousness. I argue much of this groundwork has already been laid, and the primary place that we can start is to deeply understand the paroxysms of the Black radical tradition. So what is this critical human rights consciousness? It is the ability to simultaneously be aware of the social, political, and cultural circumstances that shapes one's life, as well as one's capacity to transform them. More specifically, it provides a structure that helps one shapes consciousness into agency by filtering it through an experimental understanding of human rights as it directly developed from a praxis of resistance. Mapping the critical human rights consciousness of the Black radical tradition, we find that there are 5 components that come to bear. Number 1, we find that there was a clear understanding of internationalism. Number 2, there was a identifiable critical ideological framework that guided their activities. There was an attempt to institutionalize this internationalism and these ideological activities. There was a deep understanding of the holistic nature of this struggle. It is clearly a human rights struggle. And lastly, there was a development of an explicit counter-discourse, verbal and written. I close as I open, now with an appeal to think about the way that we think, critique our critiques, seek to build the world that we see in art, we hear in our most beautiful music, we taste in our most favorite food, so that we can stop reacting and start responding collectively.